Welcome. Tonight, we'll take a journey, not through a single place, but through time, across deserts and oceans, through ancient villages and gleaming cities, through caves lit by firelight and labs lit by glowing screens. We'll explore one of the greatest stories ever told, the story of human ingenuity, of how we shaped tools and how those tools shaped us, from the first chipped stone to the devices that now fit in the palm of our hand. This isn't a history lesson. It's something quieter, something to let your mind wander through as the world slows down outside your window. So, find a comfortable place, let your breath settle, and allow this story to unfold like a quiet stream. Because tonight, we'll follow the path of invention, step by step, idea by idea, from the earliest sparks of curiosity to the technologies that shape our world today.
Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I like to imagine Nocteria as a meeting place, a place where people from every corner of the world arrive together, each carrying their own moment in time. And if you'd like to return, you're always welcome here. Nocteria is a home for dreamers, a gentle space that opens when the world grows quiet. Here, stories shine softly, like little lights meant to keep you company. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let's begin our adventure.
It begins with a hand. Not one that writes, but one that feels. It finds a stone and lifts it, as if it already knows. The stone is struck, until a flake breaks free. A blade is born, and the world starts to change. What was once hard becomes simple. Others follow. They try, they learn. A memory takes shape through every tool made. And without words, a story begins. The first tools gave humans something new: control. With a sharp edge, they could shape the world, cut what was once unbreakable, and carve paths that didn't exist before. But shaping stone was only the beginning. Soon, they turned their eyes toward something even more powerful: fire. It had always been there, appearing without warning, lighting the sky, running across dry grass before vanishing again. They saw it from a distance. Bright, unpredictable, alive. Useful, maybe, but dangerous too. Then one day someone didn't just watch. They reached for it. A fallen branch, still glowing, was carried back to camp. Not by chance, by choice. Sheltered with care, fed with dry leaves. And for the first time, fire didn't disappear. It stayed. That changed everything. It warmed the cold nights. It lit the darkness when the sun went down. It softened food that was once hard to chew. And more than all of that, it gave time. Time to rest. Time to speak. Time to simply sit, safe in the glow. Soon, fire was no longer something to be found. It could be made by rubbing wood, by striking stone. Wherever people went, they brought it with them. It became part of every camp, every shelter, every gathering. They no longer feared the night, not because the dark had changed, but because they had. Fire didn't just change the world outside. It changed what happened between people. In the glow of those early flames, something new began to stir. Not in the hands this time, but in the voice. Around the fire, they stayed longer. They watched each other more closely. They had time. Time to look, time to listen, time to try sounds that meant something. A gesture became a sound. a sound became a call. And slowly, sounds became signs. Shared, remembered, passed on. The first words weren't many. Maybe they pointed to the things around them. Water, fire, food, danger. Maybe they spoke of places or of time. Now, later, far. At first, there was no grammar, no rules, only meaning. But that was enough. With each repeated word, something incredible happened. Memory grew. Stories began. And knowledge could move. Not just across a day, but across generations. Children didn't have to discover everything for themselves. They could be told. They could learn. The world no longer belonged only to those who saw it with their own eyes. Now, it could be described, and eventually, imagined. Language didn't appear all at once. It grew, little by little, shaped by time and need. But once it took hold, nothing was the same. For the first time, humans weren't just surviving. They were sharing. And what they shared could last. After fire had been tamed and words had begun to rise in the glow of its light, humans found themselves sharing more than food or stories. They began to share patterns of doing, of shaping, of improving what the world offered. And once again, it started with the hand. This time, the hand did not reach for a blade or a branch. It held something smaller, more delicate, a sliver of bone, carefully sharpened and pierced through at one end. The first needle. It didn't cut. It passed through. Threaded with sinew or twisted fibers, it let the hand do something entirely new, connect. Now, instead of simply wrapping themselves in animal hides or draping skins over the body, they could stitch pieces together. They could shape coverings to fit, around arms, across shoulders, down legs. Not loose protection, but tailored warmth. Layer by layer, thread by thread, garments began to form. It changed everything. Suddenly, the cold became less of an enemy. People could stay longer in places once too harsh. They could explore higher ground, travel farther in winter, rest through the night without shivering. Clothing was no longer just a barrier against nature. It became a tool of possibility. And behind every stitch was something else. Memory. Each garment held the knowledge of how it was made, where to start, how to loop the thread, when to pull, and when to let the material rest. Mothers taught daughters, hunters watched tailors, patterns repeated, improved, passed on. This knowledge had no words, not yet, but it moved from person to person like a song hummed under breath. In that simple act of piercing and pulling, something deep took root. A sense of craft, of design, of control not just over tools, but over time itself. They weren't building cities yet, but they were learning how to shape their own lives, one careful thread at a time. The land had been shaped, walked, and understood. But not everything lay on solid ground. Wide rivers cut across the earth. Lakes stretched beyond the trees. And sometimes, far on the other side, smoke rose in the distance. There was more out there, more to reach. But water stood in the way. Some tried to swim. Others held on to logs and drifted. But these were small steps. To truly move across the surface, something else was needed. Something that could carry weight, hold steady, return. So they watched the trees. A thick trunk was chosen. It was hollowed with care, burned slowly from the inside, carved with stone. What remained was smooth and light enough to float, a vessel shaped by hand and flame, the first boat. It wasn't fast, it wasn't graceful, but it worked, and it opened the world. Now rivers could be crossed, supplies could be carried, the unknown could be reached, not by walking around, but by gliding through. They paddled along quiet banks. They crossed to new ground. They returned with food, with wood, with stories. Water no longer meant turning back. It became a path forward. Before fields, before fences, life was movement. People followed where the food went, across valleys, through forests, always searching. Shelter was built and left behind. Nothing stayed because nothing could. But that way of life began to shift. Somewhere, near a river or in the bend of a wide plain, they noticed something. Plants that had once been gathered were growing again, right where their seeds had fallen. It wasn't just wild chance, it was something they could use. So they stayed a little longer. They scattered seeds with intention. They cleared the brush, made space. They waited. And the plants returned. This time they came where people wanted them. That was the beginning. The ground, once just something to walk over, became something to care for. The harvests were small, but they added certainty, a reason to remain, a reason to come back. And as people stayed near these fields, animals stayed too. Goats, sheep, later cattle. They wandered near the camps, drawn by food, safety, fire. They were no longer just chased, they were kept, guided, fed. This was something new. They built what couldn't be carried. They stored what they grew. They moved less. And slowly, the seasons stopped being something to outrun. They became something to live with. For the first time, people weren't just surviving the land. They were shaping it, staying with it. And from that stillness, everything began to grow. Staying in one place brought new challenges. The soil gave food, but it asked for more in return. Digging with bare hands or sticks could only go so far. So, they looked again at the tools they had used before, stone edges, sharpened bones, but now they needed something different. Not to hunt, not to cut trees, to work the ground. The first tools were simple: a curved stone tied to a handle, a blade that could gather grain in one sweep, a sickle. Then came digging sticks, weighted and pointed. Later they were flattened and shaped. They became hoes, tools to turn the soil, clear weeds, open space for seeds. Each one made the work faster, easier, more precise. And then, someone did more than scratch the earth. They dragged a tool behind them, first by hand, then maybe tied to an animal. It broke the soil in lines. The first plow. It didn't look like the ones we know today, but it carved furrows, rows where seeds could be placed. It helped the earth breathe. With every new harvest, they improved the tools. They shaped handles for better grip. They used stronger materials, sometimes even stone polished to a smooth edge. The field became more than a place. It became a system. And behind every plant that grew, there was now a tool that had helped it. Farming had changed what people needed. Now there was food not just for today, but for later. And keeping it safe became just as important as growing it. Leaves and baskets could only do so much. They tore, they leaked, they burned. So hands turned again to the earth, this time not to grow, but to shape. They took soft clay from riverbanks and molded it into simple bowls. They dried them in the sun, but sun wasn't enough. The vessels cracked, they crumbled. Then someone placed one near the fire, and the fire gave it strength. The first pottery was born. Rough, uneven, but solid. It could hold grain. It could carry water. It could stay. Soon shapes became more refined. Flat bottoms, curved sides, small handles. Each made by hand, each one different. And then another step forward. They built small enclosures out of stone and mud, spaces where heat could gather and stay. The first oven. Now the clay was fired evenly. The pots were stronger, more reliable. They didn't just store food, they preserved it. And when covered, they protected it from animals, from moisture, from time. With pottery, the home became more than shelter. It became a place of storage, of preparation, of memory. Inside each jar was not just food, but the effort of the harvest and the promise of tomorrow. With food to store and tools to keep, people needed more than a patch of land. They needed a place that stayed. A place that sheltered not just bodies, but lives. At first, it was simple. Branches woven into a frame. Animal hides stretched across wooden poles. Mud pressed between walls of straw. The first huts weren't large, but they were enough. Enough to stay dry. Enough to sleep through the cold. Enough to return to day after day. And where one shelter stood, others followed. A fire in the center. Space for work, for sleep, for gathering. The ground was cleared, flattened, familiar. Soon, a new pattern took shape. People no longer built alone. They built near others. Shelters became clusters. Clusters became villages. There was safety in numbers, but also something more. A sense of place. Children played between homes. Paths wore into the soil. Footsteps became routines. Homes weren't just protection from the world. They were where the world began, each day. And from that moment on, humanity was not just surviving under the sky, it was building beneath it. Life in the villages brought rhythm. Seeds were planted, animals tended, tools repaired. Fires burned each evening, and the days began to settle into something familiar. But not everything on the ground was soil and stone. Some rocks glinted strangely in the light. They were softer, red, green, sometimes shining. Curious hands placed them near the fire, just like they had done with clay. And something unexpected happened. The rock changed. It softened. It melted. From those first glowing drops, a new chapter began. What they had found was copper, a metal hidden inside the earth, waiting to be released. It could be shaped before it cooled, flattened, bent, curved. It didn't break like stone. And once hardened, it held. At first, they made simple things, hooks, beads, small blades. The color alone made it feel special. But slowly, they began to understand its strength. They carved stone tools for generations. Now, they forged. It wasn't easy. The heat had to be stronger, the control more precise. But the reward was something new. Tools that lasted longer, struck deeper, wore slower. From that moment on, the land wasn't just for food or shelter. It was a source of hidden power. In the lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where people had learned to shape fire and metal, life became more than survival. They were building things meant to last: homes, tools, pots to store the harvest. But still, something was missing. It wasn't the ground that needed changing anymore. It was the way people moved across it. Transport was slow. Heavy goods had to be carried or dragged. And the more they grew, the more they needed a better way to move. The answer came not from the road, but from the workshop. To shape clay more evenly, potters had begun placing their vessels on flat discs that could spin. At first, they turned them by hand. Then someone added a shaft, a base, a steady center. The potter's wheel was born. It was a quiet invention, one meant for craft. But it unlocked a greater idea. If something round could turn in place, maybe it could also turn on the road. Not logs rolled under weight, but real wheels fixed on an axle. Not just pushed, pulled. The first carts began to appear. Simple platforms with two solid wooden wheels, pulled by people or animals. They changed everything. Now grain could be moved from field to village. Clay pots could be carried in bulk. What once took days could be done in hours. And then, speed became its own goal. Lighter wheels, better balance, tighter frames. Carts evolved into chariots, fast, agile, drawn by horses across dry plains. They weren't just for transport. They became tools of war, of ceremony, of power. And with each turn of the wheel, the world became wider and closer. As carts rolled between villages and grain filled the jars, a new problem began to grow. There were more animals, more harvests, more people, and more to remember. Who owned what? How much had been traded? When would the flood return? Voices could pass stories from one to another, but memories faded, and words, once spoken, disappeared into the air. So they tried something different. In the cities of Sumer, people pressed marks into soft clay, wedges and lines. At first, they were simple symbols, numbers, tallies, signs for goods. But over time, they began to form thoughts, not just how many, but who, what, why. This was cuneiform. Not carved pictures, but patterns made with the tip of a reed, fast to write, hard to erase. And across the desert, along the Nile, another language took shape. Egyptian scribes carved curved lines, eyes, birds, and tools. Each one spoke a sound or an idea. They painted them on temple walls, etched them into stone, wrote them on scrolls of papyrus. These were hieroglyphs. Sacred symbols, but also records of daily life. Crops, trades, names of rulers, maps of the stars. Writing changed everything. Knowledge no longer had to travel with the person who carried it. It could stay in one place, waiting to be read. It could last longer than a lifetime. For the first time, the future could read the past. Rivers had always been roads for those who knew how to read them. In the wide lands of Mesopotamia and along the banks of the Nile, boats had long carried people and goods from shore to shore. At first, they were simple, logs tied together, hollowed-out trunks pushed with poles. Good enough to float, good enough to follow the current. But currents don't always lead where you need to go. And not every journey waits for the river to choose the direction. So eyes turned upward. They watched how the wind moved the grasses, how it pulled the smoke across the sky. And slowly they began to understand. If wind could push the air, perhaps it could push the water too. The first sails were likely nothing more than stretched cloth or animal skins, tied to a frame, held high. But when the wind caught them, the boats moved, not just with the river, but against it, across it, beyond it. Sailing had begun. Now people could travel farther without waiting. They could explore coastlines, trade across open seas, connect distant settlements, and with new ships came new designs. Flat-bottomed boats for slow rivers, long, narrow vessels for speed, sturdier hulls for the waves beyond the shore. On calm waters and open seas, the world began to open wider. What once had been the end of a journey, the river's edge, the ocean's reach, became the beginning of another. As trade routes grew longer and knowledge crossed rivers and seas, people began to share more than grain and cloth. They shared techniques, secrets carried in hands, not words. How to build, how to shape, how to heat the earth until it gave something new. The discovery of copper had changed tools and daily life. But it was soft. It bent. It wore down quickly. Then came something stronger. By combining copper with tin, two metals rarely found in the same place, craftsmen created a new material. Harder, sharper, more durable. Bronze. It marked the beginning of a new age. The Bronze Age. Swords, axes, chisels, ornaments, all brighter, tougher, longer lasting. From bronze tools and crafted implements, cities began to grow, not only from stone and wood, but from metal shaped to serve and to endure. Status was expressed in metal, and so was skill. But bronze had a limit. Tin was rare. Too rare for a world that was growing fast. And so, the search continued. In time, they learned to tame another element, one even harder to control: iron. It took more heat, more skill, more patience. But when mastered, it changed everything. Iron didn't just improve tools, it replaced them. Plows cut deeper into the soil. Blades held their edge in battle. Nails built stronger homes. From Mesopotamia to Anatolia, from Egypt to Europe, the Iron Age swept across continents. And with it came larger cities, new conflicts, greater achievements. What began with sparks and firelight in a village forge became the heartbeat of empire. The glow of the forge no longer belonged just to farmers or craftsmen. It had become the heartbeat of rising cities. And with it, a new kind of shape emerged, one made not for the soil, but for the struggle to protect it. Long blades, sharpened with precision, began to appear in the hands of warriors. These were not tools for harvesting grain. They were made to hold a line, to defend a path, to claim a border. The sword was born, straight and strong, forged from bronze or iron. It carried more than an edge. It carried meaning, strength, courage, fear. To wield one was to speak without words. And yet, not every battle was fought at arm's length. Some held wooden shafts tipped with fire-hardened points or polished metal, lances, spears, projectiles. They brought reach, strategy, and formation. Thrown across fields or braced in walls of warriors, they changed how conflict unfolded. No longer random clashes. Now, there was order. Lines, ranks, signals, plans. From ancient Sumer to the Nile's edge, across the coasts of the Mediterranean. Weapons became part of identity. They marked roles, they carried traditions, and with them, societies began to shape their own systems of defense, of power, of ambition. In the quiet before battle and the silence after, the metal told its own story, of lands contested, of people rising, and of how even the most brilliant invention can be turned to protect or to conquer. Not everything people built was meant to be lived in. Some structures weren't about comfort or shelter at all. They were meant to be seen, to impress, to remind. As communities grew and belief systems took shape, building became something greater than survival. It became expression. In the broad river valleys of Mesopotamia, rising above the flat earth, stepped towers began to appear. Ziggurats, massive layered platforms made of sun-dried bricks, each one narrower than the one below. They weren't homes. They weren't fortresses. They were bridges of sorts, between earth and sky, people and gods. Far to the west, in the heart of Egypt, a different silhouette began to rise. Pyramids, monuments of stone, cut with precision and placed in perfect alignment with the stars, built not with haste, but with purpose. They held the bodies of rulers, yes, but also the hopes of eternity, the math of the cosmos, the will of a nation. Temples followed, vast and echoing, carved pillars, high ceilings, long courtyards filled with light and shadow. These were places for ritual, memory, and power. Places that gathered the people and anchored entire cities. None of it was simple. Lifting stone, cutting blocks, organizing thousands of hands. It required vision and tools and time. And perhaps that's what made them different. These structures weren't built for a moment. They were built for the ages. Even now, their shapes remain. Not untouched, but unmistakable. Proof that, long before steel and glass, human ambition had already reached for the sky. Great cities didn't rise by accident. They needed grain, shelter, protection, but most of all, they needed water. And water, as vital as it was, didn't always flow where it should. Sometimes it flooded the fields. Sometimes it vanished in the dry season. And sometimes it lay just out of reach. So people began to shape it. In the river plains of Mesopotamia, long channels were carved into the earth. They guided the floodwaters, sent them where crops would grow, kept the villages from drowning when the river rose too high. These were the first canals. Dug by hand, fed by gravity, they turned wild rivers into steady lifelines. Elsewhere, walls were raised to hold back the flow. Dams made of stone and clay, early defenses against both drought and destruction. They stored water for the dry months, softened the blow of sudden storms. But as cities grew, so did their thirst. In ancient Egypt and beyond, people learned to lift water from the river to the fields, with buckets, levers, and clever wheels. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But it worked. And later, in the heart of Rome, the vision grew even bolder. High above the valleys, long arches carried water across hills and distance. The aqueducts. Not just pipes, but feats of balance and precision, bringing clean water into crowded cities, feeding fountains, filling public baths. Each drop followed a plan. Every stream, a sign of civilization. Because a city that could control its water could control its future. Building something grand is never just about vision. It's about precision, about the tools, the methods, the quiet steps no one remembers. The pyramids rose high, but they didn't appear by magic. Beneath their weight lay a system, one made of ropes, ramps, and reason. Egyptian builders used simple instruments to solve complex problems. With a triangle of wood called the A-frame level, they found balance. With cords pulled tight between stakes, they drew perfect lines in the sand. And with weighted plumb lines, they aligned their world to gravity itself. These weren't guesses. They were measurements, repeated and refined, day after day. Moving blocks that weighed tons required more than strength. They dragged them across slickened sand, built long ramps that curled upward with the structure, and timed their efforts with the flood of the Nile when water softened the earth. But building was only part of the Egyptian craft. Recording it was just as vital. Long before paper, they pressed reeds into thin strips, dried them, and created papyrus. Scrolls of knowledge that carried prayers, inventories, plans, and laws. Their brushes were fine, their pigments lasting. They wrote in color, on stone and scroll alike, and nothing was left to chance. They shaped glass long before it was common, blowing it into vessels and coloring it with powdered stone. They dyed linen with shades drawn from nature, earth, minerals, crushed shells, and they sealed their work with heat, resin, and time. Even boats bore their mark. Light crafts built of wood and reeds, pushed by poles or guided by sails. The Nile was more than water. It was a road. And along its shores, canals branched out like veins, feeding fields of barley, wheat, and flax. Crops didn't grow by luck. Ditches, levees, and basins were dug with care. They watched the river, marked its rising, and carved calendars into stone to predict its moods. And once the harvest came, grain was stored in great silos, counted, sealed, protected, not just for months, but for years. It wasn't just a kingdom of gold and stone. It was a system, measured, written, built to last. Long after the rivers of Egypt had been measured and tamed, a new kind of vision began to shape the world, not through stone and scale alone, but through thought. In the hills and islands of ancient Greece, technology took on a different form. It wasn't just about building higher or digging deeper. It was about understanding how the world worked and using that knowledge to shape it. They watched the stars, traced their movements with strings and circles, and from that, they created calendars, maps, and theories of motion. They built temples with perfect proportions, not just for beauty, but to explore harmony itself. Each column, each step, was part of a pattern. And behind it all, there was math, Euclid's lines, Pythagoras' ratios, a geometry of space that turned stone into language. But the Greeks weren't only thinkers, they were makers. In the harbor cities, engineers built cranes, winches, and catapults. Not to dream, but to lift, to move, to defend. Their tools were clever, their hands precise. Archimedes, working in the city of Syracuse, designed machines that could move water uphill. A spiral tube that turned with a crank, pulling water where it was needed. He studied levers, floating bodies, and balance. He proved that knowledge could be practical. In Alexandria, Heron built something even stranger. A hollow sphere that spun when steam escaped from its sides. It was simple, maybe even a toy. but it whispered of things to come. They built automata, water clocks, and early forms of surveying equipment. They mapped the sky, predicted eclipses, and debated what stars were made of. They looked outward, but also inward, at logic, structure, and the rules behind what could be seen. For the Greeks, invention wasn't just survival. It was a path to truth, and in every lens polished, every weight lifted, every gear that turned, you could feel that idea taking shape. The sea was never a barrier for the Greeks. It was a road. Surrounded by islands and peninsulas, they learned to navigate early. Their ships were light, fast, and clever. With sails for wind and oars for precision, they explored, traded, and fought across the Aegean and beyond. The trireme became their signature, a long vessel powered by rows of oarsmen stacked in 3 levels, capable of ramming enemy hulls and turning swiftly in battle. Built not just with strength, but with balance. Every beam, every plank was chosen with care. Shipyards echoed with saws and hammers, but also with voices solving problems. How to steer more accurately, how to carry more cargo without sinking, how to stay afloat during storms. On land, the Greeks faced new questions. How do you protect a city? How do you breach a wall? They developed siege engines, simple at first, then more refined. Ballistas hurled stones, torsion catapults launched bolts with force and precision. These weren't just tools of force, they were engineered systems, tuned like instruments. Engineers traveled with armies. They studied terrain, built bridges, drained marshes, and fortified strongholds. Their knowledge wasn't locked in libraries. It moved, adapted, lived. At the same time, Greek cities developed advanced water systems. Some tunneled through hills with astonishing accuracy, using simple tools and mathematical planning. Others built fountains, cisterns, and drainage channels, early blueprints of urban design. Each invention, whether in wood, stone, or bronze, was part of a larger idea, that through logic, observation, and testing, the world could be shaped, not just endure. The Greeks gave shape to beauty. The Romans gave it weight. Where the Greeks saw balance, the Romans saw permanence. Not just in thought, but in stone, in brick, in concrete, that could last 1,000 years. They didn't just build for ceremony. They built for the crowd. Temples, yes, but also baths, markets, roads, arenas. Massive spaces where thousands could gather, speak, wash, trade, live. The secret was their concrete. A mix of volcanic ash, lime, and water, poured into wooden molds and left to harden into structures that outlived empires. It was lighter than stone, but stronger with time. It set even underwater. With it, they created the impossible. Domes that hovered in space. Vaults that carried weight over wide spans. Arches that multiplied strength, turning gravity into grace. The Pantheon still stands. Its dome, unreinforced, still the largest of its kind after 2,000 years. And beneath it, no pillars. Just space, open, silent, sacred. They built roads, too, straight as a blade, layered in stone and gravel, drained by shallow trenches. Some are still walkable today, cutting through hills, crossing rivers, joining one province to the next. These weren't just paths for soldiers. They were lifelines. For messages, for trade, for the pulse of an empire that never slept. Each structure was planned, each brick laid with reason. Because to the Romans, building wasn't art. It was destiny made visible. If Roman stone spoke of permanence, Roman water spoke of control. The empire flowed not just with soldiers and merchants, but with water that traveled farther than any army. Clean, cool, steady, carried not in buckets, but through arches that spanned valleys and channels that crossed hills. They built aqueducts, some narrow as a man's shoulder, others riding high on tiered arcades of stone, each one tilted just enough to keep the water moving, falling slowly over miles, never rushing, never stopping. From mountain springs to city fountains, the journey was silent and constant, no pumps, no magic, just gravity and 1,000 careful calculations. Inside the cities, the water branched like veins, public baths where rich and poor washed side by side, fountains in crowded squares, basins in kitchens and courtyards, and beneath it all, drains and sewers that carried waste away, most famously the Cloaca Maxima, still running beneath the streets of Rome. Water wasn't just a convenience, it was a message. That the empire could bring order to chaos, that it could tame rivers, fill cisterns, nourish crops, even in drought. And unlike the temples or the roads, this power didn't tower over you. It whispered through walls, ran beneath your feet, and appeared fresh and cold from a spout carved in marble. Not all Roman wonders stood tall. Some warmed your feet. Others locked your door, lit your room, or counted the hours of your day. Inside the villas of the wealthy, the floors breathed heat. A system of brick channels ran beneath the rooms. Fires lit in a side chamber pushed warmth through these narrow passages, and the stone above held the heat like skin in the sun. This was the hypocaust, a silent engine of comfort, heating not just private homes but vast public baths, where marble steamed and walls echoed with voices. Windows, too, began to change. They weren't open to the wind anymore. The Romans shaped sheets of glass, still cloudy, still crude, but enough to soften the light and close out the cold. Even the small things mattered. Metal keys turned bronze locks. Oiled hinges let heavy doors swing with ease. Water clocks dripped time into bowls, marking the passing day with soft, measured rhythm. In busy kitchens, tools made work easier. Grain mills turned by hand or mule. Presses squeezed olives until they wept oil. Wheels spun with ropes to lift heavy jars or lower supplies into cellars. They made automata too, small mechanical figures moved by water or weight. Not toys, but proof that nature's forces could be harnessed, redirected, made useful. In every corner of Roman life, there was purpose, a design behind the design. Because for them, civilization wasn't just walls and laws. It was living well, by design. The Roman army didn't just march, it built. Every time soldiers stopped, even for a single night, they raised walls, dug trenches, planted stakes. Every camp was a miniature city, laid out in straight lines, squared by compass and eye. Their strength was not only in numbers, but in how they shaped the ground beneath them. When they came to rivers, They didn't wait. They built bridges, fast, strong, temporary. Wooden beams, iron clamps, ropes pulled taut across currents, then dismantled just as quickly once the legions passed. In siege warfare, they were methodical. Their machines weren't inventions of rage, tools of pressure. Ballistas, scaled to different sizes, hurled stones with force and precision. Onagers, with twisted ropes and counterweights, sent heavy projectiles arching over walls. Siege towers rolled forward on wheels, climbing as they advanced, wooden staircases pushing upward toward battlements. Behind them worked engineers, calculating angles, building ramps, draining moats. Every campaign was a construction project. Even supply was an art. Warehouses along the roads, grain moved by carts and ships, standardized packs, tools, weapons, all made to fit, to last, to be replaced without delay. The army wasn't just a force, it was a system, powered by knowledge as much as by will. They conquered not only through battle, but through mastery of space, weight, and time. When the empire fell, its roads cracked, its aqueducts dried, its cities shrank. But the idea of building, of shaping the world through tools and knowledge, didn't vanish. It moved. Across the hills and valleys of medieval Europe, life grew slower. Villages rose where once there were marble forums. Stone replaced concrete, wood replaced brick. Yet even in that stillness, change was at work. People turned to the rivers, not just for fishing or washing, but for power. They built water mills with wooden wheels turning in quiet streams. These wheels ground grain, sawed timber, and pressed olives. For the first time, a force other than muscle moved machines, steady, tireless, and free. In windy lands, windmills followed, simple but clever, gathering motion from the air itself. Farms grew more efficient, time was saved, labor shifted. Then came the mechanical clock, not to mark prayer alone, but to divide the day into moments. A series of gears and weights pulled on themselves, counting hours with quiet clicks. No more guessing the sun's angle. Now time had teeth and wheels. Armor changed too. What once was leather hardened into mail, interlinked metal rings that flowed like cloth. Then came plate armor, forged to the shape of a man, turning soldiers into iron statues that could walk. Weapons adapted in turn. Crossbows, simple to learn but deadly at range. Trebuchets, vast slings of rope and stone that shattered walls from a distance. Abortions, yet innovation wasn't only for war. In monasteries and towns, craftsmen shaped glass into curved lenses. Placed before tired eyes, these became glasses, a quiet revolution that let knowledge live longer. And in workshops lit by candlelight, artisans carved letters into wooden blocks, inking them, pressing them, printing pages one by one. Long before Gutenberg's press, the idea was there, a seed waiting for its moment. This was no dark age. It was an age of preparation. The land was resting, but its people were learning to build again. While Europe rebuilt, on the other side of the world, another story of invention had never stopped. In the cities of China, where calligraphy flowed like music, and towers bent with tiled roofs toward the sky, technology evolved not through conquest, but through refinement. They worked with paper, not parchment or hide, but true paper made from fibers and water, pressed thin, dried smooth, and folded like silk. It carried not only words, but the memory of a people. From wood blocks carefully carved, they printed whole pages. Art, poetry, laws, all repeated with ink and pressure, a new kind of memory, shared and multiplied. And then there was the compass, not a dream of direction, but a magnetized needle floating in water, always pointing south. With it, maps changed. Merchants crossed unfamiliar lands. Sailors dared to leave the coast. They studied the stars, too. Their astronomical clocks were towers of gears and wheels, marking not just hours, but the movements of the heavens. Bronze dragons dropped balls into bowls, ticking time like a heartbeat of the cosmos. And in the quiet of their alchemical experiments, they stumbled upon something fierce, a powder that burned with fury. At first, it was a curiosity, used in fireworks and light displays. But in time, it would shape far more than festivals. This wasn't a world of scattered tools. It was a civilization of systems, where science, art, and engineering were threads of the same cloth. While others rebuilt, China continued to invent. And the winds of those inventions were already beginning to blow west. As Europe recovered and China expanded, a third current flowed strong, linking east and west through desert, sea, and script. In the great cities of the Islamic world, Baghdad, Cordoba, Damascus, Cairo, knowledge was not just preserved, it was refined, tested, expanded. In Baghdad, the house of wisdom stood like a beacon. Greek texts were translated into Arabic, not word by word, but idea by idea, absorbed and transformed. From these studies came new questions and new tools to answer them. They perfected the astrolabe, an ancient device reborn, used by navigators to find their way by the stars, and by scholars to chart time and prayer. In optics they saw what others missed. The scholar Ibn al-Haytham studied how light moved, how the eye perceived, and how lenses could bend vision. This was not mysticism. It was method, observation, and repetition. They built ingenious machines powered by water and gravity, fountains that changed height with the sun, clocks that chimed with birds and bells, irrigation systems that turned barren lands into gardens. Mathematics advanced too, from algebra, named from the Arabic al-Jabbar, to algorithms that would one day shape machines. And while their doctors studied anatomy and medicine, their engineers designed instruments, tools, and mechanical marvels. But more than anything, they created a bridge, connecting the preserved knowledge of the past to the possibilities of the future. Ideas flowed across deserts on camelback and across oceans in cargo holds, carried not by conquest, but by curiosity. Something had been stirring for a long time, quietly beneath the ashes of fallen empires. Inside monasteries, where texts were copied by candlelight. In workshops where tools were shaped by hand and habit. It wasn't a single spark. It was a slow awakening. In the cities of Italy, from Florence to Venice, from Milan to Rome, people began to look again, not just at the heavens, but at the human form, the proportions of buildings, the flow of water, the design behind nature. They called it rebirth, and it would touch everything. a dome began to rise in Florence, one that seemed to defy gravity. Filippo Brunelleschi, trained not only as a builder, but as a clockmaker, invented machines to lift stone into the sky. He brought back Roman methods, yes, but also something new: perspective, mathematics, and reason, used not only to support the structure, but to imagine it before it existed. In nearby studios, painters learned to guide the eye with vanishing points, turning flat surfaces into windows that opened onto space and story. Geometry was no longer a curiosity. It became a tool of the imagination. But perhaps no mind captured this moment better than that of Leonardo da Vinci, painter, anatomist, engineer, musician, dreamer. He saw no boundary between art and science. He filled notebooks with inventions far ahead of their time: flying machines with beating wings, underwater breathing systems, rotating bridges, armored vehicles. He designed tools of war and tools of peace. He studied the flow of rivers, the curve of a spine, the laws of optics, the heart of the human body. His ideas were often sketches, not blueprints, but they spoke of a world not yet possible, and yet deeply understood. And he was not alone. Niccolò Machiavelli studied the mechanics of power. Leon Battista Alberti wrote of architecture as a language. Luca Pacioli explored the structure of numbers, laying foundations for accounting and double-entry bookkeeping. Further north, in Germany and Poland, other eyes turned to the sky. Nicolaus Copernicus imagined a bold idea: that Earth moved, not the stars; that the sun, not the planet, was the still center of motion. His model would shake the very structure of knowledge. Tycho Brahe, half nobleman, half astronomer, built vast instruments by hand. Quadrants, armillary spheres, tools to measure the sky without a telescope. His data was so precise that it became the stepping stone for Johannes Kepler, who found that planets moved not in perfect circles, but in ellipses. Then came Galileo Galilei. He pointed a simple telescope toward the heavens and saw what no one had seen: craters on the moon, moons around Jupiter, stars too many to count. He built instruments as well: a thermoscope for measuring heat, a proportional compass for engineers, pendulum-based clocks, and experiments that tested the motion of falling bodies. His work was bold, his conclusions dangerous, but his curiosity was unshakable. During these same decades, the invisible world began to open. In Switzerland, graphite was sealed into wood, creating the modern pencil. In Germany, Peter Henlein crafted the first portable timepieces. Watches were born, counting the world in minutes and hours. Light, glass, gears, all began to work together. And while the telescope looked outward, the microscope turned inward. Lenses refined by Dutch craftsmen like Zacharias Janssen would soon reveal the hidden layers of life itself. But perhaps the tool that changed everything wasn't made of metal or glass, but of letters. In mines, Johannes Gutenberg perfected movable type. Printing became multiplication. Books no longer belonged only to the elite. Knowledge began to spread across borders, languages, and classes. The Renaissance was not a single city, not a single man, not even a single century. It was a change in direction, a moment when humanity stopped looking only backward and began to imagine forward, when invention became not just recovery, but vision. And through parchment and ink, through brass and bone, through lenses and levers, that vision took form. For centuries, power had come from wind, from water, from the strength of the body. But beneath the green hills of Britain, something ancient waited to be burned. Coal, dark, dense, and buried deep, was more than fuel. It was promise. And when men brought it to the surface in cartloads, they weren't just feeding fires, they were feeding change. In the early 18th century, a quiet transformation began. Not with thunder, but with steam. The steam engine, first simple and crude, was born to solve a problem, to pump water out of mines that coal itself had made necessary. But as the idea grew, so did its reach. James Watt, a Scottish inventor with a careful mind, saw the inefficiencies and redesigned the engine. He added a separate condenser, saving energy. He made steam work harder. And with that, the age of machines truly began. Soon, steam no longer just cleared mines. It moved wheels, lifted hammers, powered looms. It turned iron, not muscle, into the heart of work. In spinning mills across Manchester and Lancashire, textile machines spun cotton faster than hands ever could. Spinning jennies, water frames, power looms. Each one faster, stronger, more precise. What had once been a cottage craft became factory labor. The hum of threads replaced the silence of home weaving. Work changed shape. People moved, leaving farms for cities, fields for furnaces, independence for wages. The factory became the new cathedral. Its tall chimneys smoked from dawn to dusk. Its floors echoed with clanks and rhythm and repetition. It was the beginning of something immense. A time when tools no longer just extended the hand, they began to replace it. Once people walked, then they rode. But now they began to glide, over rails of iron, pulled by engines that breathed steam. The train was more than a machine. It was a signal of speed, of distance shrinking, of time changing. The first locomotives hissed and clattered through the English countryside. They connected coal towns, factory cities, ports, and soon railways spread like veins across continents, carrying people, goods, and ideas faster than ever before. Not long after, the oceans too were crossed by power. Steamships, heavy and strong, no longer waited for wind. They traced steady lines across seas, linking continents like never before. Commerce was no longer seasonal. Travel no longer uncertain. But perhaps the greatest force was the one that could not be seen. Electricity. It began with sparks, with experiments and glass globes. Then came the battery, built by Alessandro Volta, a quiet stack of metal and cloth, capable of holding a charge. That charge became a message. Through long wires strung from post to post, the telegraph whispered dots and dashes across nations. Samuel Morse's code carried news, orders, and love letters, all at the speed of light. Then came the telephone, born from ideas in two places: Antonio Meucci in Italy, Alexander Graham Bell in America. The voice, once confined to rooms, could now travel miles. And with the turn of a switch, darkness itself began to retreat. Thomas Edison's light bulb, practical and lasting, brought day into night. Entire cities began to glow, wired with copper, powered by generators. alive after sunset. Nikola Tesla dreamed further. He harnessed alternating current, sending energy not just from here to there, but everywhere. Electricity moved more than wires. It moved sound too. In workshops filled with coils and copper, inventors began to ask, could sound be captured, not just sent? And soon, the answer came. The phonograph, designed by Edison, etched vibrations onto cylinders of wax. The voice, the music, the memory, frozen in grooves, ready to speak again with the touch of a needle. For the first time, music could travel without the musician. A melody could echo from a machine. It was the birth of audio recording. The first step toward speakers, headphones, radios, and sound systems. Tools that would one day fill entire rooms with rhythm and voice. Meanwhile, as people moved faster across land and sea, others began to rise. Balloons, airships, gliders, each tested the boundary between air and earth. And with altitude came a challenge. The human body was not made for thin air, nor for freezing wind. So early aviators began to experiment, with layers of insulation, with sealed helmets, with suits designed not for style, but for survival. They were not yet spacesuits, but they were the beginning. A new kind of clothing, shaped by pressure, crafted to protect the body in places it had never gone before. The age of machines had given humanity power, distance, and speed. But it was also beginning to ask a new question. How far can we go? And how will we survive when we get there? By now, the hum of machines was constant. Factories pulsed with light. Trains threaded continents like metal veins. But the ground was no longer enough. Humanity wanted to move faster, not just across the earth, but through time itself, capturing moments, replaying sound, extending memory. It began with fire, once again trapped, not in a furnace this time, but inside a chamber of metal and air. The internal combustion engine, a small explosion, controlled and repeated, turned wheels not with steam but with sparks and pressure. It was lighter, faster, and more personal. Carl Benz built one of the first automobiles, a three-wheeled machine that rolled through narrow streets. It was noisy, strange, uncertain, but it moved on its own, and that changed everything. Soon, others followed. Engines grew stronger, roads grew longer, and the world began to spread outward. Then came a new idea, not about the engine, but about how it was built. In America, Henry Ford imagined something simple and radical. One worker, one task, repeated in rhythm. The assembly line. Instead of moving people to the work, he moved the work to the people. Production soared, costs dropped, and the automobile, once a curiosity, became a part of ordinary life. But motion wasn't only mechanical. It reached into the senses, into memory, sight, and sound. In quiet studios, inventors captured light. The photograph froze time. No longer would faces fade or landscapes be described in words. They could now be seen, exactly as they were. And then came sound. Thomas Edison's phonograph scratched grooves into a spinning cylinder. When replayed, they spoke. Voices returned. Music echoed. Soon, the gramophone flattened those grooves onto discs. Easier to store, easier to share. Loudspeakers amplified the sound, no longer a whisper, but a presence in the room. Wooden cabinets, vibrating diaphragms, coiled wires. The first sound systems brought concerts into homes, turning living rooms into stages. Music was no longer fleeting. It could be recorded, preserved, repeated. A melody could survive its moment. In cinema, images learned to move. Audiences watched as shadows danced, horses galloping, trains arriving, people laughing. The Lumiere brothers turned motion into magic. Soon, cameras rolled faster and projectors flickered brighter. And behind the screens and the music, new devices quietly took shape. Amplifiers, microphones, early magnetic tape recorders, technology that caught sound like a net catches wind. With every passing year, memory became more than what the mind could hold. It could be stored in a photograph, a song, a reel of film. And just beyond the edge of this moment, the world was preparing to speak, across distance, across silence, with no wires at all. By the early 20th century, the world was no longer the same. Cities were buzzing with electric lights, telephones connected people across great distances, and the rumble of automobiles had joined the clatter of trams and bicycles on the streets. But beneath this surface of progress, the winds of global tension were rising. The First World War brought with it a dark chapter in human history, but also an unexpected surge in technological innovation. Armies no longer marched in neat lines, they moved with machines. The battlefield saw the arrival of armored vehicles, modern submarines, and aerial warfare for the first time. Planes, once fragile contraptions, were now used to observe enemy positions, drop payloads, and engage in air maneuvers. Synchronized firing systems mounted directly onto aircraft changed aerial engagements forever. Wireless radio, which had emerged thanks to the work of Guglielmo Marconi, became essential for communication between trenches, ships, and command posts. The skies and the seas were no longer quiet. Voices and signals traveled invisibly, shaping the outcomes of battles from afar. Beneath the oceans, submarines evolved into stealthy machines capable of changing the tides of war. The concept of silent movement below the surface, once the dream of visionaries, had now become a terrifying reality. These vessels operated with diesel engines on the surface and switched to electric power underwater, a configuration that would remain the standard for decades. The war also pushed the development of motorized transport, field logistics, and portable weapon systems, giving rise to many technologies later adapted to civilian use. But it was only the beginning. When the Second World War erupted, technology took another giant leap. Nations poured unprecedented resources into innovation. Aircraft became faster, stronger, and capable of crossing entire continents. The race for air dominance led to innovations in pressurized cabins, onboard oxygen systems, and high-altitude flight suits, laying the groundwork for future spacesuits. Radar systems emerged as silent watchers in the sky, detecting approaching aircraft and guiding defensive strategies. At sea, advanced sonar allowed submarines to hunt or evade their enemies with increasing precision. Behind the scenes, entire cities became laboratories of invention. Secret programs decoded encrypted messages, giving rise to the first electronic computing machines, like those used to crack the Enigma code. This marked the birth of digital calculation, which would soon transform the world. But perhaps the most dramatic and sobering technological shift came with the development of the nuclear energy. Scientists like Enrico Fermi, working during wartime, helped unlock a powerful new force that would later influence energy, medicine, and space exploration. Not far behind, rocketry moved from theoretical experiments to devastating practicality. Wernher von Braun and his team created the V-2 rocket, a weapon that soared beyond the stratosphere before crashing down on distant cities. Though born in war, these rockets were precursors to the vehicles that would later carry satellites and astronauts beyond Earth. By the end of the conflict, the foundations for a new age had been laid. Satellites, space travel, and even the first ideas for orbital missions were already being drawn on engineers' tables. Human technology had reached a point where the Earth was no longer the limit, and so, out of destruction, a strange truth emerged. The same tools used to divide and destroy were now opening the door to something far greater, the vast unknown beyond our planet. As the dust of war began to settle, a new question rose. What lies beyond the sky? In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Just a beeping metal sphere, yet its message was clear. Humanity had crossed the atmosphere. Soon after, the United States responded. NASA was born, and with it, the dream of sending humans into space. But rockets alone weren't enough. The body needed protection against vacuum, cold, and radiation. Engineers designed pressurized suits, evolved from wartime flight gear, turning clothing into miniature life support systems. Meanwhile, rockets grew more advanced. Multi-stage boosters, heat shields, telemetry, all part of a new era of exploration. Back on Earth, another frontier opened, sound. For centuries, music was live or lost. But now, through magnetic tape, microphones, and amplifiers, it could be recorded and replayed. From vinyl to radio to cassette, audio became portable, immersive, and deeply personal. Speakers improved, rooms filled with rhythm. Even astronauts brought music into orbit, sound as a bridge to Earth. Space and audio, though distant in form, moved together. Both were waves, light, sound, radio, rippling through the invisible. It was a time when the human voice reached farther than ever, across the stars and across the heart. In the second half of the 20th century, innovation gathered pace. The skies were no longer reserved for astronauts. Flight became a part of daily life. The Concorde, sleek and supersonic, symbolized a world reaching for speed and connection. Though its journey was brief, its image endures, elegant and bold. Wide-body jets like the Boeing 747 reshaped global travel, shrinking distances for millions. In Japan, another breakthrough changed the ground beneath us. The Shinkansen, fast, smooth, and reliable, redefined land transport. Cities were linked with speed and grace, setting a new standard that soon spread worldwide. Inside homes, change flickered on screen. Color television turned black and white news into vivid moments. Satellites extended broadcasts across continents, making the world feel smaller. And behind it all, a quiet chip rewrote the rules. The microprocessor, tiny yet powerful, moved computing from rooms to desks. Calculators entered classrooms. Early machines helped factories run with rhythm and precision. It was an age when speed met imagination, from soaring planes to humming circuits, all pointing to one truth: the future was already unfolding. In the early 1980s, technology stepped out of the lab and into the living room, the classroom, the hand. The personal computer arrived, compact and full of promise. Apple, IBM, and others released machines that turned coding into creating. With a click, users could write, draw, calculate, and play. New ways of thinking emerged. Icons, windows, and the mouse reshaped how people used machines. Computing became not just technical, but personal. Entertainment followed close behind. Arcade games lit up malls with pixelated adventures. Then came home consoles, turning living rooms into playful worlds. Names like Nintendo and Sega became part of everyday joy. Meanwhile, voices broke free from wires. Mobile phones, once rare and bulky, grew smaller and more common. People spoke across cities, moving untethered. Then came a shift no one could ignore. The internet, once reserved for researchers, opened to all. With the World Wide Web, a screen became a gateway. Pages, messages, ideas, shared across the globe in seconds. Visuals transformed too. Televisions grew brighter. Cameras went digital. Photos became easier to take and easier to share. Music followed the current. CDs, digital sounds, and new tools shaped a new kind of rhythm. Even the smallest tools changed life. Word processors, spreadsheets, printers, once rare, now routine. This wasn't just invention, it was integration. A digital world, woven into the rhythm of everyday life. As the 21st century began, technology was no longer a novelty. It had become part of everyday life. But even so, change accelerated faster than ever before. In 2007, one device reshaped modern life: the smartphone. A screen, a camera, a map, a computer, all in the palm of your hand. It didn't just change how we called, it changed how we lived. Navigation became effortless, guided by satellites. We began capturing the world from above, with drones flying through skies once untouched. Beneath these devices, another shift was happening. Artificial intelligence started shaping daily choices. Apps learned what we liked. Voices spoke back. Robots entered homes and workplaces. Not just lifting or sorting, but learning, helping, adapting. 3D printers turned ideas into real objects. Layer by layer, creation became personal and fast. Meanwhile, the internet connected us all, from emails to social networks, from simple pages to immersive worlds. It became a place where we spent our time, not just a tool, but a space. In just over a century, we had gone from steam engines to digital minds, from the first flight to orbit, from silent tools to thinking ones, from messages on paper to light-speed connections. But with every tool, a question remains. Will it bring us together or pull us apart? Create or distract? Heal or control? The future is not written. It lives in the minds of those who imagine and in the hands of those who build. You've just followed a story older than any book. A journey from fire to circuits, from carved stone to networks of light, from questions to answers, and back again. Now, the world hums with invisible signals. It listens. It remembers. It waits. But sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is pause, close our eyes, and breathe. This story continues. Somewhere, someone is shaping the next chapter. And maybe, just maybe, it will bring us closer to each other, or to the stars. Thank you for walking through time with open ears and a quiet heart.